Hello, audience. And most of you are probably familiar with this thing. This is my 1918-ish Model T truck, and I've mentioned in several videos at the front of this thing, it's had bits and pieces of two different series on it, and nothing really fit really well, and it took me a few years to figure out what was going on and what I wanted to do about it. The last time I put this together, I fixed all this so it's all conformed to the same series. At the time, I didn't have an example of a low hood or a high hood car to show you, so I described the differences to the best of my abilities, and judging from the comments, it seems like that was adequate. But now, at the moment, we have this car in here. This is a 1923-ish runabout, and we're replacing the top on it, which I'm not filming because I already made a video series on the interior and top on a 25 runabout, and this is the same thing. But the important thing is, this has the high hood on it. Now the truck, when I put that back together, that's got all the stuff for the low hood. So we now have an example of each one, and we can compare them to see exactly what the difference is. But first, we'll start with the basics. Just what exactly am I talking about here? Well, the first variation of the Model T is what we now call the brass era, obviously because of the massive amount of brass trim that was used on them, most notably the radiator. And that was used through 1916. There's a lot of production changes in that time, but that's pretty much one series. Now, in 1917, or arguably late 1916, it was replaced with this style, which we now call the low hood. Most notably, the radiator's different. It's dimensionally a little different, a little bit taller, but it now has a separately fitted radiator shell on it, painted body color. The hood is different, and the hood, instead of abruptly stopping at the Firewall like the earlier cars did, it's actually the same shape as the Firewall, so it blends all the lines together, makes it look a little more modern. Also with this series, they did away with the flat fenders, and they're more rounded off now. And this series was used through 1923. The interesting thing about this series is, even though it was introduced in 1917, this cowl section design and the Firewall dimensions actually came out in 1915 when they were still using the brass radiator, and the Firewall and hood former were kind of like an adapter that stepped this down to the early hood. Now, what's interesting about that is if you have a low hood car or a body that's made for a low hood, you can convert it to a brass era car with not much difficulty. If you can get a 15 or 16 hood former, it'll bolt right up to this. You can get a 16 or earlier hood and radiator, and that'll attach on like so. However, they don't really clear the later fenders. You have to notch those out, and the hood hooks will be in the wrong place. So if you want to do it right, you got to get the early fenders, the early hood shells, and the early aprons. But the point is, you don't have to touch anything on the body from here back. And it may not be an authentic thing to do, but a lot of people do that just for fun, and it is an option. The high hood was introduced sometime during 1923, and this is kind of an ongoing argument with enthusiasts. The general rule is it was introduced at the beginning of the 1924 model year, but were some really late 23s using the high hood? I don't really know, and I don't really want to get into that argument. All I know is the judging standards read that it came out in June of 1923, so I'm just going to go with that. And as the term implies, the radiator, the hood, and the Firewall are slightly taller and slightly wider. Why they did this, I'm not entirely sure. Probably just to make it look more modern. Functionally, it doesn't really make much difference. I mean, the radiator does hold slightly more coolant. There's a little bit more airspace around the engine, but not really enough to make a difference, and they're not really prone to overheating anyway. But one thing that is worth mentioning is the high hoods. They're traditionally the preferred choice for hot rods just because they have a bigger engine compartment. You don't have to butcher them as much to put different engines in them. Also, those fiberglass replica Model T bodies that they sell for hot rods, they're dimensionally based on the high hood bodies. So this series was used through 1925 and was used on the TT trucks through 1927. Now, even though it pretty much looks the same as a low hood from the outside, pretty much everything on the front, or most everything on the front, is slightly different and may look like it interchanges, but not necessarily. And if you're building a car up from parts, or you bought a car that somebody built up from parts, and you're trying to figure out what on earth you have, like I've been doing with the truck, this might help you identify it. So at a glance, when I'm looking at a car and I'm trying to figure out what year range it is or what series it is, generally the bottom of the radiator shell is the first place I look at, because on the low hood, it's got this thin strip that goes across it that just barely covers the lower tank, pretty much like the brass era cars, and the front crossmember and all this is exposed, and you can see where that might be a rattle, but anyway, it looks like this. You can actually see an air gap between the frame and the radiator. On the high hood series, there's a separately fitted front apron which goes on here and completely hides the frame, and the crank actually goes through it. This is also a separate part from the radiator shell, and another little difference is the front fenders have a small apron on them to go with it. However, this isn't exactly the most accurate way to tell the difference, because on the low hoods, this part of the shell is usually ripped off and missing, and on the high hood cars, a lot of people don't even bother to put the apron on, so a lot of them just kind of look the same. So start out the actual height of the radiator. Now, I'm not going to measure it from the bottom tank, because the height of that can vary from one car to another depending on who made the radiator or when it was made. I'm going to measure it from where it mounts to the frame, which conveniently it has this reinforcement bar that goes through the core, so that makes it easy to figure out where that is. And up to the very top, this is about 19.5 inches, somewhere in there. Now these are not very specific measurements, this is just to give you the general idea. It's going to vary a little bit from one car to another. And on this one, it's about 21 inches. The radiator shell on the low hood, at a glance, one difference we see is the sides of it just point straight forward and back. And on the inside, it is up tight against the radiator. The height of the radiator shell, also from where it mounts to the frame, to the very top, this one's about 19 3/4, 19 7/8, somewhere in there. And width is about 20 inches, just a little bit short. Yeah, let's call it 20 inches. On the high radiator shell, the sides kind of taper out slightly and somewhat match the direction of the hood sides. Also, there's a bit of an air gap between the radiator and the shell. Now this one doesn't seem to have them, but typically these later ones, there's brackets on here that attach the radiator shell to it, kind of like a Model A. Oh wait, this one has the lower one. And the radiator shell itself, about 21 1/4. Width, about 20 inches. Now like I said, this shell actually tapers out, so the back of it's going to be quite a bit wider than the front. And the overall width of the shell is about 21 1/4, somewhere in there. The Firewall on a low hood, at a glance we can see a few differences. Now on the sides, it's pretty much straight up and down. The curve across here is kind of harsh, and it's pretty much flat across here. Actually, there's a slight curve across the top, but it almost looks straight. Now, the height of the Firewall from the top of the frame rail is about 21 inches, it looks like. And overall width from the widest point is about 24.5 inches, somewhere in there. On the high Firewall, at a glance, so you can see this bead is running straight up and down. Well, the outer shape of it, this actually leans out a little bit. It gets a little bit wider as it goes up. The curve across here is a bit more subtle. And the top of it here, also, this bead is straight. There's a slight arc across here. It's not perfectly flat. So the general outside shape of it is just a little more rounded off. On this one, overall height from the frame rail is harder to tell. About 22 inches. And width from the widest part of the firewall is about 28 inches. And now the actual hood itself. On the low hood, the bead at the bottom sticks out a little bit from the side, about a ½ inch. And there's no indentation around the hood hooks. On the low hood, the height of the hood sides, from the very bottom to the center of the hinge, is 12 inches at the front and 13 inches at the back. And the hood tops, from the center of the hinge to the center of the hinge, about 13 7/8, almost 14 at the front, and about 16 1/4 on the back. On the high hood, the bead down here at the bottom is a lot narrower than the early one, and they have these indentations for the hood hooks. I don't know if all of them had them, but every high hood I've seen has those. On the high hood, the sides from the bottom to the middle of the hinge, it's about 13 1/2 on the front and about 14 at the rear. The hood tops from the center of the hinge to the center of the hinge, about 14 1/4 at the front and about 18 1/8 at the rear. The hood shelves, even though they look pretty similar, are also different. This is for the low hood, so you can see this outer line is straight all the way from the front to the back. And the hood shelves on the high hood, from up front they're pretty much the same. You get towards the back, and it flares out a little bit where the hood hook is, because the hood hook is a little bit further out. Even the front fenders are slightly different. Now, like I said, on the high hood it has this apron that hides the front of the frame, and the fenders also have a small apron on the corner here to go with it. And that's not separately fitted, that's actually built into the fender. The earlier ones don't have this. And that's what the early one looks like. Now, up to now, we've been talking about everything from the Firewall forward, and you may be wondering, as I used to, well, they scaled up the hood, or the whole front of the car at this point. What did they do to the rest of the body? Did they scale that up too? Well, I don't really know anything about the closed cars, so I'm not going to talk about those. They're a different kind of animal. But for the open cars, actually from about the windshield back, they're dimensionally about the same. Now, around this time, they also introduced the oval fuel tank bodies, and a lot of production changes happened around this time, but the general dimensions are about the same. The location of the windshield, this surface, and the mounting holes, they're in the same place. This has a later windshield that's slanted, but the holes are in the same location as they are on the truck. Now, this line here where it goes from the windshield frame to the firewall, this whoop-de-doo here is a little more straight, a little more subtle because it doesn't go down as far, and on the sides it's the same thing. And I think that's about it. So anyway, I hope some of you restorers found this helpful. I sure learned a lot just from making this. I wanted to make this video for quite some time, but this is the first time I've actually had an example of both types right here in front of me. And after going over both of them with a tape measure, I'm actually quite surprised at how similar some of this stuff really is. Now, you may have noticed I haven't said anything about the 2627 series. Well, that's because I just don't really know them all that well. I'm not going to pretend that I do. I've never really had to build one up from nothing and figure out what's supposed to go with what. Otherwise, I'd tell you all about those too. Anyway, that's it for now. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.